so that you can go back and review this again if you want to. Victoria will make this into a YouTube video, and every one of the 5 sessions will be available, excuse me, for you to see. And you can also have this PowerPoint, excuse me, I have allergies. So you can access this PowerPoint. What a day for my allergies to act up. You can get a copy, so don't make the notes on the PowerPoint, just make some notes on what I say. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of NAWE's members. We've grown tremendously in the last 2 years, and because of it, our voice is heard, although mine isn't so good right now.
Are we supposed to be looking at slides, or can I just ask?
Yeah, Bonnie, thank you. Good question. You should see a slide right now with the logo of every one of NAWE's members.
No, not seeing that. I don't think the slides are being shared. We're just.
I see the slides.
I can see it.
No, we can see it.
All right, let me think. Oh, I had to click on. Sorry, I needed to click on that. Sorry.
Okay, you're all set now? I'm glad you said something now. Thank you, Matt. Good, okay. Next slide. Here's what I'm going to talk about. We'll do an overview of federal assistance, then we'll dip into grants for the rest of the discussion. We'll do changing trends, because there's a lot of trends that are changing right now in the federal assistance world. Projects and strategies, and then talk about the programs, 3 programs in depth. Go on. So what is federal assistance outside of a whole boatload of money? There's 4 different types of federal assistance. There's grants, there's formula programs. We're going to talk a lot about grants today. Formula programs are when money goes from the federal government through the state departments of transportation to each state, and the states get their monies by a formula. The gas tax is an example of that, and that's how a lot of highway projects are funded. But there's some formula money that you can access if you work with your state DOT. For example, at-grade rail crossings. If you have an at-grade rail crossing right outside your port and you would like to get rid of that at-grade rail crossing, it's one of the #1 projects to be funded in the United States because they are the #1 safety hazard for rail. More people have been killed at grade rail crossings than any other rail-related accident. So if you could get your project in your state transportation improvement plan, which is called a STIP, State Transportation Improvement Plan, then you can get formula funding to pay 100% of the removal of that at-grade rail crossing. And that would also improve the access to your port. Low interest loans are available, and we'll talk a little bit about 3 of those today very quickly. But those are Treasury rate loans, long-term, and I'll give you some of the terms when we get to that point in the presentation. And then tax credits. There's no tax credit right now for marine terminal related assistance, but NAWE is going to be fighting this coming year to try to get a tax credit if a marine terminal operator acquires a piece of cargo handling equipment that will contribute towards the Biden administration's net zero goal at 2050. So we're trying to get not only zero, but near zero emission equipment because that also meets the goal of resilience. And we're going to fight for a tax credit for the industry. That's all I'll say today about tax credits. Who's eligible? We'll talk about that. Yes, Alice, thank you for your question. The slides will all be shared and this is being recorded. So they'll not only have the slides shared, but the recordings will be made available by Victoria on YouTube. We have our own YouTube channel that she's put together. So all 5 sessions will be available, but you only get the certificate if you attend the 5 in person. We'll talk about applicants and we'll talk about eligibility of projects to go back to who. So it's eligibility of applicants and eligibility of projects. And then how and when, how do you find out when these grants are available? Notice of funding opportunity, NOFO. Notice of funding opportunity is a mouthful, so I'll try to say NOFO more often today. What's the criteria for that? And then again, just mentioning that we will be pushing at NAWE to get legislation for a tax credit for the industry for cargo handling equipment. What's changing? What have I see happen in the 15 years I've been doing this? Number one, right now we have more money available for port and terminal projects than we've ever seen in our careers. This year alone, legislation was passed through IIJA, in fact, it was passed last November, that offers 28 new programs, or 28 programs of funding that you can compete for. The Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program has $450 million a year this year and the next 4 years after this. And we may get more money if the fiscal 22 budget is passed for some programs. So it's worth looking into. It's worth making an investment to see if federal assistance is the right answer for you. However, there's shorter application times being offered because the pressure on the DOT, with all the money that's being thrown at them by Congress, the pressure is to get this money out and get it working. They aren't going to shorten their review time because they have to jump through a lot of flaming hoops with the Department of Justice and the OIG to make sure that it's all done right. And they have a lot of people to make happy in the way they award the grants. But the application time is what they can shorten. What does that mean for you? It means greater planning needed up front. It means you need to know what your capital projects are. In the past, you would have like 3 months to put an application together. So you could actually take 2 or 3 weeks and say, what do I want to do? What's possible? Now you need to know up front. What are you going to do? What are you going to use the money for? How are you going to put it together? How are you going to compete? And how are you going to answer their over? There's more competition than in the past. With the Tiger grants, the very first year of Tiger, 100 ports applied for Tiger projects. After that, it dropped down to about 60. And you'd be competing with about 60 other applicants for your allocation that went to the port projects. Now you're going to see over 100 applications every year for every program, except for marine highways. That's a finite bucket of applicants. New team of reviewers at the USDOT. I still have friends there, and behind the scenes, they shared with me that there are going to be new reviewers. When we had the same reviewers for over 10 years looking at the applications, these people got trained in multimodal projects. So they may have had a highway background when they started doing it, but over the 10 years, they learned maritime terminology. They learned that the road doesn't stop at the gate. The highway goes all the way to the dock to enable the truck to go and exchange freight from the vessel to the terminal. They know that the rail goes all the way to the dock so that you can get freight from rail on, from the vessel onto the rail, off the terminal. I mean, we know terminal is a transfer point, but we had to train an entire slew of reviewers what the port is and how the port fits into the surface transportation system and how the surface transportation system goes all the way to the dock. It doesn't stop at the gate like they used to think it did. These new reviewers aren't going to know your terminology. So that means no jargon in your applications. If you have acronyms, put an acronym dictionary in your application. You may know the difference between a dock, a wharf, a pier, and they won't. I actually read an application a long time ago where the person who wrote it thought they were making it more interesting. And sometimes they said it was a dock project, and other times they called it a pier, and other times they called it a wharf. But I know those are 3 completely different physical facilities with different purposes and different construction and different shapes. And the other people didn't. They thought they were asking for money for 3 completely different projects, and they rejected the application and said it wasn't well written because it was 3 different projects and they only had funding for one of the projects in the application. So be very careful to write it in plain English. What I always recommend to people is buy a card to your favorite coffee store, buy a yellow highlighter, a really, really bright one, and hand this to your next door neighbor that knows nothing about the industry. And when you have your draft application done, have your next door neighbor read it and highlight everything they don't understand. And then before you submit the application, go back and make sure all those things highlighted are in plain English, so that somebody who's got a highway background, somebody who's got a rail background, an economist, somebody who's never done anything in maritime can understand what you're talking about and why we need it. And sadly, there's tighter Buy American restrictions. The Obama administration was the last administration that actually understood why we needed the legal Buy American exceptions and waivers. This administration doesn't. This administration took the tightening from the Trump administration and has made it even tighter. And yet we know as industry, we can't buy ship-to-shore cranes in the United States. They aren't made here. We know we can't buy straddle carriers here. But what we need to do is focus on what we can get here. What do we already own? And there's some strategies. For example, if you have a linear dock and you've got dock A or dock 1, dock 2, dock 3, and you're going to build dock 4, and they all line up with each other. Rather than telling them you're going to buy new equipment for dock 4 from China, let's say it's the ship-to-shore cranes, now you've put your entire application in jeopardy. But if you say you're going to roll your old cranes down there from dock 3 to the new dock 4, and that's how you're going to work the dock, that's a little more acceptable to them. And you can buy those new cranes and put it on dock 1. It doesn't matter. But don't put the new crane on the new dock, because they just won't look at your application. They'll say that it's there to support the importation of something. We don't want U.S. taxpayer dollars going for the importation of ship-to-shore cranes. It's a huge issue. There's a lot of nuances, a lot of questions, and we'll hold those for a little bit later. But if you do have questions while I'm talking, as Victoria said, use the signals. So raise the hand. We'll try to recognize it, or Victoria or Heather will interrupt me, and then we'll answer the questions on the spot, or you can hold them to later. And you could put them in the chat box, and Victoria and Heather will be monitoring that for me and making sure that we answer all your questions. Next slide, please. And by the way, I'm not going to take the whole 2 hours today, so don't be nervous about that. I will give you time back. What are the marine terminal operator projects that qualify for grants? These are big buckets. There's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 big buckets of projects. I actually have a detailed list because of when I was at the DOT. We took these header buckets and we identified every possible project that could fit into a bucket that could get funding for a program. So if you have questions about something that's a subcategory in these buckets, give me a shout. We can go over it. We can talk about what you're interested in, what you're looking at, what you want to consider, and whether or not it might fit in a bucket. Next question, next slide, please. And what do we recognize, or what do we here? You know what? This is actually my personal recommendation, that you do a strategic multi-year approach. Look at your capital plan for your company. Do an analysis of the available federal funding that you're interested in. And you could actually chart over the next 2 years what dollars you want to apply for which projects in your capital plan. And then you can seek potential partners. I remember the year that Ports America was really innovative. They had a project at Port Newark, and it got funding, so that's why I can talk about it. And at that time, the Port of New York and New Jersey, that Port Authority, was overcommitted on credit obligations and could not put their name on an application saying that they would be the sponsor of a grant. So Ports America had to seek another partner, and they found a partner in Essex County, New Jersey. And it was considered an innovative partnership for a county rather than a port authority to apply for a grant. And they got a grant, and it was the first year they applied for it too. They wrote a really good grant. So look for innovative, potential eligible public partners, because there's very few programs that you as private companies can apply for. Oh, thank you, Bridget. So as I said before, IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and when you read these NOFOs, The NOFO will call the acronym BIL, but it refers back to what I call IIJA. 28 separate programs. I read 1,096 pages. I read the IIJA Act and found 28 programs that you're eligible for. We're not going to cover all 28 today. I'm just going to touch on some of them because you haven't got all day to sit here and listen to me cough. Infra. So infra is funded at 1.6 billion each year. And note on top, it says from fiscal 22 to fiscal 26. So starting this year, the infra NOFO is not out yet, but 1.6 billion. It's for multimodal projects. You fit in that bucket. Congestion mitigation, air quality. You know, this program is managed by Federal Highway. So it's considered a highway program, but I know for a fact that congestion mitigation, air quality. Hey, Tom, you know, I love you guys. Thanks for saying something. Congestion mitigation, air quality has funded mobile harbor cranes. They actually bought Liebherr mobile harbor cranes, and they got a waiver from Federal Highway for the crane that came from Austria. So there is precedent for it. I think in order to get the crane, what the port had to do, and it was a little port in Massachusetts, what they had to do was put cold iron. Oh, they also did cold ironing at a small port, CMAC. But they had to do cold ironing for some trucks, which was kind of strange. So they put a truck plug at the dock and painted a space on the dock where the truck could park and plug in. Nobody ever used it, but it fit the qual. You know, they got free money for doing it. So what the heck? There was another port. They got 1.5 million in Virginia. I think it was Richmond, Virginia. Got CMAC money to buy a crane. So don't discard federal highway programs. You may be thinking you're in a port, but be creative and think DOT. You know, you're multimodal. There's a program called Early Relocation of Utilities prior to a transportation project underway. If you know that you've got utilities that you need to relocate and you know you're doing a project, even if you're not going for any other federal funding, if you can get your state to pay for the relocation of the utilities, the federal government will pay 100% of it back to the state. And I think that's huge. Nobody tells you about this stuff. It's buried in that 1,096 pages. Fueling and charging infrastructure. Now you may think from the top of your head, oh, it's just going to be for electric vehicles, but it's not. It talks about propane. It talks about hydrocarbon. So if you need fueling and charging infrastructure for any of your cargo handling equipment, and it's more than just electric, you may be wanting some propane stuff, you know, get your grant people or your consultant to look at fueling and charging infrastructure. Reduction of truck emissions at port facilities. That's the title. There's more detail behind it. Again, that's another one you're going to want to pick up and have your consultants help you, or your team at work help you tap into those dollars. There's National Infrastructure Project Assistance. It's also called the Mega Project Fund, and that will fund projects up to $500,000. They won't pay for 100% of the projects, but we know in the industry to start a port from scratch today and to build something, it's going to cost over $1 billion. And that's from the gate to the dock. So $500,000 will really help. Excuse me, there's a program called the Protect program. Resilience, this is the first time we see the word resilience being used in ports. NAWE, we've been working the Hill for a couple of years now, and we actually have a slide that Victoria made absolutely beautiful. Victoria, I should have included it in this program, and I didn't. And it shows impacts to port facilities just in the last 18 months. And we show where an ice storm has shut down Texas. Hurricane Ida last year came up through the Gulf, and how many states did it hit? We've had Superstorm Sandy. That was a long time ago, but you might not remember the tornado that went through the docks in Jacksonville and just made a crane into just a twisted pile of spaghetti. Protect is something that will help you build more resilience into your port projects. Next slide. CRISI is something that ports don't talk about too much, but I know some of the key ports are tuned into CRISI grants, and they're for rail infrastructure and rail safety improvements. There's a railroad crossing elimination program that actually duplicates the formula funding program for at-grade rail crossings. So now you've got two pots to go into. And then the three in green are what we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about today, because those NOFOs are on the street right now. Next slide, please. Have to go back to those low interest federally backed loans. TIFIA is Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. And I know that TIFIA projects are funding port projects. There's actually 2 sentences in TIFIA that address multimodal projects, and that's right where the ports fit in. So you could get a TIFIA grant and have it be your non-federal match or part of your non-federal match. So as I'm going to say, and I'm going to say it again because it's so important, your federal match is up to 80% of a project. That's what it states in the NOFOs. But they want the non-federal match to be 20%. But the more non-federal match you have, the more competitive you are for those federal dollars, because they don't have a dollar to give to everybody who wants a dollar. In the Port Infrastructure Development Program, for every dollar of request, they have 25 cents to award. In the RAISE program, for every dollar of request, they have a nickel to award. So you really need to find those matching funds. They want the federal dollar to be the final dollar needed to bring the project to life. They don't want the federal dollars to be the reason the project is moving. So for TIFIA, you could say that you're going for this is easy, a $70 million port project. Easy to hit 70 million on a port project. And you want 25 million, 30 million. I don't do math in my head real well. You want 30 million to be your private match, and you want 40 million to be the federal dollars. But you don't have 30 million. But you could actually get TIFIA to be up to 30% of the total project. So you could have 40 million in federal dollars, and you could have TIFIA money, and then you could have your money. Because TIFIA money is considered your money because you have to pay it back. But TIFIA will last for the life, the term of TIFIA will be the life of the project. So if your project has an easy 30-year life expectancy, your TIFIA loan is 30 years. But it's 30 years after you complete construction. So if you know that you're going to get the grant and you're going to be able to break ground 18 months after you get the grant awarded, and I'll explain that later, and then your project is a 3-year construction time. So now you're 4.5 years down the road, let's say 5, because again, I don't do numbers real well in my head. And 5 years from now, when the project's complete, is when you actually start paying your loan back. You don't pay it back while you're under construction. They give you a chance to get it rolling and get some business going. And it's at Treasury rates. So the rates are going up a little bit. They were under 3% for the longest time. It's really good, cheap money, but it has strings just like grants do. RIF projects are focused on railroads. RIF money has gone to ports. They are better. They used to have a really bad reputation, but they've improved the process in that program, and they are. So RIF's worth looking at again. It takes between 9 and 18 months to get one of these loans. So if you're going for a loan or a grant in 23, 24, 25, 26, one of those out years, it's worth it to start looking at the TIFIA or the RIF right now as your part of your match, so that you don't have to put so much of your money down. And there's a brand new transmission facilitation program. I wrote in here especially this, they wrote a special eligibility for Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico, and we do have a valued member of Puerto Rico. For TIFIA loans, do you have to match? I didn't see the rest of that question. It went away. Let me see the question. Do you have to match the term to the length of the improvement, or yes, it can absolutely be shorter. Absolutely. And you can use the TIFIA loan as a bridge loan and say you just want it for 5 years and then you pay it off, and you're fine to keep going. You can also, there's also something called private activity bonds. I didn't put it on here, but you as private companies can directly get the private activity bonds, and you can directly get TIFIA and you can directly get RIF. You don't have to go through a public partner. Next slide, please. You know, if you're really interested in this, let us know, and now we can do a special 2-hour webinar on the loans. We know people at the Build America Bureau who could do that for us. Other programs to consider, you know, these are some gotchas that are buried in that 1,096 pages, and I thought I'd pull them out for you. State freight corridor planning. We've had this before where Federal Highway said to the state DOTs, you have to incorporate freight planning in your state DOT. And a lot of the states took it seriously, like Texas was the first one to actually establish a maritime division within their state DOT. Very few states had them at that time. Of the 38 states that have navigable waterways, Texas was the 8th state to do a maritime department, and we still have less than 20 that have maritime departments in their state US DOTs. But a lot of them took the state freight planning seriously. Now it's state freight corridor planning. So when you think of a state freight corridor, think of I-70. I-70 touches multiple states, but it also has that navigable waterway of the Ohio River that follows and parallels part of it. Think of I-95 and think of the Atlantic coast. So I-95 touches how many states? And we've got the I-95 Freight Coalition. It's a big corridor, but they have not incorporated using the Atlantic Ocean as part of their state freight corridor planning. And that's now being encouraged. So you can have a port on your state freight corridor planning committee. You may want your local port, especially if it's a large one, or one who's active in the community, to consider being on that. And then they can help carry your interest to that. There's a new requirement. Boy, this one just raised lots of red flags. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up when I read this one. Requirements for railroad freight cars placed into service in the US. A year from now, we should see the regulations that will restrict the source of any freight car purchased to be placed into service in the US, and restrictions on the source of the technology. They don't want the technologies coming from one of 5 nations, and you can imagine what they are: China, Russia, Iraq, North Korea, and I forgot the 5th one. But those are 5 nations identified by the Department of Defense as being nations of concern. So they don't want any technologies from those nations. And I can see that today they're looking at railroad freight cars. Tomorrow they're going to be looking at ship-to-shore cranes. In fact, there's already 2 pieces of proposed legislation addressing the technologies on ship-to-shore cranes and restricting the sourcing of ship-to-shore cranes from one of those 5 nations. And yet 75% of the world ship-to-shore crane market is sourced from China. Very few other sources available, none in the United States. US hasn't made a ship-to-shore crane since the late 1980s. And we've never made anything like what they sell today. Doesn't mean we can't, it just means it's not an option, so you can't even consider it. So we need to keep, now he's going to be keeping an eye on that. Another one I found interesting is in this infrastructure program were sentences about controlled substance testing for mechanical employees of railroads. You know, we're next. Camel's nose is under the tent. We need to keep an eye on it. What will this mean for our industry? New regulations will be due out May 14th of this year on what this means for the railroad industry. If you operate a short line or if you work closely with a short line, you may be interested in this right now as opposed to waiting for how it's going to hit maritime. But basically, it's expanding the definition from intoxicated to alcohol or multiple substance impaired. And the fines for repeat offenders will be increased. I know that this is addressed in the collective bargaining agreement, but as employers, you may be interested in this. And then underride protection. New regulations are due out mid-November. Underride protection, if you haven't been following it, vehicles, personal vehicles, cars have been at times going under trucks. It's a huge controversy. It's sad, very sad. Gloria Estefan's bus ran into a container truck, a truck pulling a container. So our industry has not been free from this. Underride protection not only says, do guardrails have to be on the back of the vehicle, but now they'll have to be on the side of the vehicle. The regulations will state what the strength of those have to be, whether or not it's applicable to chassis. If it's applicable to chassis, how will that increase the weight of the chassis? I've worked with IICL, the Container Leasing Industry Association, and they predict that it will add 4,000 pounds to a chassis, which means you still have to meet those road limits. So if the chassis is heavier, how much is the load you can put in the container on the chassis before it leaves the terminal? Can you stack the chassis? Right now you can stack a chassis with the rear underride guard protection, but if it has side guard protections, will you be able to stack them as well? If you can't stack them, how are you going to store them? If right now you have 25 slots and your terminal for stacking chassis, and you have 5 in each slot, does that mean you have to go to 125 lay down, at yard slots for chassis? I mean, that's just huge. So we'll keep an eye on it for you and let you know what's going on with that. And that's the end of keep an eye out for. Now let's delve into grants. Next slide. Federal budget. Oh, I'm getting feedback. Okay, it's gone. So with the federal budget, I touched on it before. 3 programs are going to come out in the federal budget. We're confident they're going to get money, but the question is how much money? We don't know what that is. PIDG has $450 million allocated through that IIJA program for 5 years. The federal budget for 22, the president's authorizing, or the president's asked for about $230 million. So we think we'll get at least $200 million. We're hoping for more. The way the NOFO for PIDG was written, if monies are allocated in the fiscal 22 federal budget, those monies will be added to the IIJA appropriation. So they will not do a special addition. You have to apply for the NOFO now. And then if you don't get a grant now, and the grant application period closes before the fiscal 22 budget comes out, your application may be thrown into the pot for the money for federal 22. So we're going to keep an eye on that and let you know how that's working. And that information will be shared through the legislative committee meetings and through the federal NAWE's newsletter, The Lift. AMH, Marine Highway Program, we expect monies to be appropriated for that in addition to the 25 million they're getting now. So there may be another 10 million up to 20 million put in the pot. And then port security grants are not part of IIJA, but they will be part of the federal budget. The president's asked for $100 million for those. They usually get $100 million. The question is how that money will be allocated. So we encourage you to apply for port security grants because they can award a smaller grant. You could do something like if you want to update the technology on your ship-to-shore crane and you want to buy locally sourced technology or technology from one of the many nations that is not one of the 5 I talked about earlier, a port security grant would pay for that. What about radiation portal monitors? Port security grants would pay for those. They're pretty expensive. It'd be nice for you to get some free money to pay for those. Replacing your cameras, that's another port security grant. Putting up fencing. Thinking about all the things that add up to your security systems and security. When I started in the port industry, security was like, gosh, maybe less than 5% of your annual operating budget. And the last time I looked, it was up around 15% of your annual operating budget because of so many mandates. So look at the port security grant program. It is a burr under my saddle that less than 50% of the port security grants go for port projects. They're actually called in the Department of Homeland Security website for them. They're called community grants, and they're not the community grants. They're called port security grants for a reason. The program was started for you guys. It was meant for you guys. And then ports stopped applying for grants for a while because they were doing okay. If you come back to the program, I think you can get a little more money for that. That's just my opinion. Next slide, please. What to expect. This is the real surprise. This is what I learned from working in the executive branch for so many years. And when I walk the Hill, I talk to them about this timeline because they had no idea that if they approve a project in November of 2015 or 2021, that the NOFA will be released in March of 22, and that the money actually won't start working for a year and a half after that. So 2 years after Congress appropriates the money is when the money actually starts working in public. And so now you're going to start to see shorter timelines, like the legislation will say the USDOT has to put out a notice of funding opportunity within so many months or so many days of the appropriation. That's because now he's been working the Hill saying to Congress, you need to force them to get it out and not just do it on their timeline, but they know how to do it. They've got the teams in place. Just make them do the work, and don't let them push it off for political reasons. So here's the averages. From the time the application deadline closes, it's an average of 4 to 6 months for the review process. From the time they announce you're going to get an award, it's 6 to 12 months for obligation. Obligation means you have a grant agreement in place signed by you and the federal government, and that's a negotiated document. That document cannot be completed until you have your NEPA done. So that's why we have an entire session in this grant series on NEPA, and Buy American, really important things, and benefit cost analysis. You can't get a grant or an award unless you've got those 3 boxes ticked. Once it's obligated, that means you can spend the money. Now your project begins. And the money will evaporate in 5 years or less. And they'll tell you in the grant agreement how much time you have to spend the money. But most programs now allow you to use the money for 5 years. After that, the money evaporates. Once it evaporates, can you ask for an extension? Well, you can ask all you want, but they legally can't give it to you. The only way to get an extension is through a legislative process. So you actually have to get your congressman to put a bill in to extend the program, and then it extends it for every applicant, not just for you. And that has been done once already. So there is precedent for it if you absolutely needed it. But you have to show absolute hardship and why you couldn't complete that project in the 5 years, because you sign a contract, and as part of your obligating grant agreement, you have a scope in there and a schedule. So the obligation is scope, schedule, and budget. You tell the government they're going to give you so much, you're putting up so much, and for that money, you're going to do this scope of work, and you're going to do it in this time frame. So every time your project time frame slips, maybe through a hurricane, maybe through the grid broke down, maybe because you couldn't get labor for construction, maybe because the supply chain shortage impacts and you couldn't get the commodities and materials you needed to build the project. You've got to document all those in your agreement. And then after your 5 years is done, or sooner, let's say you finish the job in 3 years, they close the grant out, but the federal obligation continues for 3 years after that. They have a federal follow-up period. And that's also in your grant agreement. And it says what they're going to follow up and how you have to report for the success. They have to measure the success of the federal dollars. I've thrown a lot at you right now. Oh, here we've got another question. Oh, Rob Mariner's on the line. Rob Mariner, oh my God, he's just an icon for me. He actually ran the Tiger programs for I can't tell you how many years. And Rob says the funding expenditure deadline is 5 years after obligation, not when the funding is obligated for specific. Rob, great clarification. Can you come online and talk about that for a moment? Because you've got to correct what I said.
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so typically, whatever program you're attempting to apply for, there's going to be an obligation deadline. For example, for this round of RAISE grant funding, if awarded later this year, your project, you have to have negotiated and executed a grant agreement, which means all pre-construction activities. So that's environmental, final design, PS&E approval, and so forth would have to be completed before you're able to sign and execute a grant agreement. For FY 2022 funding, the obligation deadline is September 30, 2025. So anytime before September 30, 2025, you can sign and execute a grant agreement. However, the expenditure deadline is 5 years after the the obligation deadline. So it's not when you obligate for your specific project. The expenditure deadline is tied to when the funding obligation deadline is hit, which is typically 3 years after the funding is offered by Congress. So hopefully that clarifies, some things a little bit.
Rob, thank you very much.
No,
And
my pleasure.
Rob, well, I know you're with Trans Systems now. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I know that Trans Systems is teaching 3 of these webinar classes. So please ask Rob any questions you want. I know he's going to be part of the team there.
Yep.
Jim, I know Jim Dubay is on the line as well. Thank you, Jim. Next slide. So any questions before we go into 3 programs? Any other questions or comments? All right, boy, this is taking longer than I thought. Let's see if I can do this in less than an hour. So RAISE, the NOFO has been released. There's 1.648 billion available. Approximately the same amount between 1.5 and 1.6 billion are available each year from now through fiscal 26. The deadline for applications is April 14th. So you should be already working on this. It's it's a little more than a month away. And it's due by 5 p.m. Eastern. Those times are important. Some end at 5 p.m., some end at 10 minutes to midnight. You've got to look because at 5:01, they won't take your application. Also, I want to say from years of experience, the last day, sometimes the system's overwhelmed and you may not be able to get in. So I always recommend that you submit your application before the April 14th deadline. All grant funds must be obligated. And Rob, I know you just said 25, but I pulled it out of the NOFO that it was 26. Yes, and I had
Yeah, thank you.
I had spoken earlier.
Sorry about
Yeah, that's all right. No, and you just said based on appropriations. So when I had said earlier, based on the fiscal 22 budget, raise could be increased, and Rob said could be increased to 3 billion total. They could get another $1.5 billion.
Yeah.
This could be a big project pool of money. But think of 3 billion and how many times will 25 million go into it?
Right.
No single grant will exceed $25 million. The minimum award for an urban area is 5 million. The minimum award for rural is 1 million. USDOT does not like to do less than $10 million grants because it takes just as much effort and personnel to do a $10 million grant administration as it does to administer a $1 million grant. They have the same hoops to jump through, no matter how many zeros are after the numbers. Only public entities are eligible as to be the applicant, but P3, public-private partnerships, are encouraged and still considered innovative. So for you to be part of the application process, we encourage that. I like to include some suggestions for projects. You may want to consider a RAISE application to reduce emissions in your area, to create life or safety improvements in the community adjacent to you, because these are multimodal projects. Include training programs in your applications for RAISE, PIDG, which is the Port Infrastructure Grant Program, or Marine Highway. Including training project will always give your application a little extra look. Primary criteria for RAISE is safety. Well, you can read it here. The environment, quality of life. It's the same ones we had from Tiger. In fact, this is the same program. It's just called, every administration changes the name of it. Any questions on RAISE? We spent a lot of time on PIDG, so let's go on. PIDG. I tried to change this. In fact, I did. In the Obama administration, we changed the program name because first we had the US Code for Port Infrastructure Development before we had the grant program. And we started calling it Strong Ports. All one word, Strong Ports. And it was a Strong Ports program because we just thought that was cool. And we thought nobody wants to be on the PID team. I couldn't get any one of my employees in the federal government to be encouraged about PID, but I could get them encouraged about Strong Ports. And then we had people volunteering to be on the team, just like everybody wanted to be on the Tiger team. The Tiger grant team people were cool. We were part of the Tiger team. So we were part of the Strong Ports team, but the Trump administration thought that was an Obama name. So they changed it back to PID and now it's PIDG. because that's the grant program. So you'll see PIDG a lot. You can even Google PIDG now on the internet, and the Port Infrastructure Development Program will come up. The NOFO's on the street, $450 million is available. They're going to take a little bit of that out for administration fee. And as I mentioned, this could be an 8-year relationship for the team at MARAD that administers these. So they need the money to fund the grant team so that they can have the employees and the contractors necessary to do the follow-up on all the projects. Application deadline is May 16th by 10 minutes to midnight Eastern. And this is a grant program for port and intermodal connectors. This is the most complex NOFO issued ever by the US DOT. I looked at the number of pages. I turned it into a Word document so I can plow through it. Excuse me, the Word document on this NOFO is 413% longer than any other ever issued for any program, or for this program. The Word document for RAISE is 56 pages. The Word document for PIDG in 2019, the first year was 10 pages. The second year was 10 pages. In 2021, PIDG was 15 pages. This year it's 77 pages long. And you have to read every page. Yeah, and Rob, we had talked earlier. Thank you for your note and for reinforcing it, but there may be an additional 230 million for appropriations from fiscal 22 budget. So who are the eligible applicants? Again, public entities. And again, no single grant will exceed 25 million. You've got the primary criteria there. It's the same primary criteria they've had each year. But if you had an application from 2020 or 2021 and you want to revive it, don't just put a new cover SF 424 on it. You actually have to amend your application. This year, there's new eligibility for projects that improve safety, efficiency, or reliability of operations. So you may have had an unsuccessful application for the past that would accomplish one of these goals. The efficiency or reliability of terminal operations was not a priority before. So you may want to rewrite your application to make that a priority. This one includes resilience. We've never had resilience as part of a PIDG eligible project. They're looking at reducing or eliminating port-related criteria, pollutants, or greenhouse gases. You'll see the acronym GGE, greenhouse gas emissions. Emission mitigation measures that provide for the issue of shore power for vessels if the grant meets all the other requirements in the NOFO. We've had cold ironing paid for by Tiger and fast lane projects before, but now cold ironing could be through this program as well. I thought a really interesting footnote I found is they made a reference. They actually didn't use the words passenger vessel security and safety or crime scene prevention training. They just put CFR codes in there. And they said, these CFR codes are also eligible. But if you look up the CFR codes, it's passenger vessel security and safety and crime scene preservation training. This is the first time that any of these USDOT multimodal infrastructure programs could apply to anything for cruises. Because in the past, cruises have always been viewed not as a part of the economy or as part of transportation, but as a recreational thing. Why would you want to put federal tax dollars into infrastructure for a golf course or into infrastructure for a local swimming pool? You don't want to do that. You don't want to pay for a local hotel. And they viewed the cruise ships as floating hotels and not as real transportation. But now we've got passenger vessel security and safety. So, and very interesting. Next slide, please. There's actually a section and there's dollars segregated for small port projects or small projects. And to know the definition of the two, small projects are less than 11.25 million. So if you have a small project, you could get into a separate bucket of money that's been carved out of the PIDG grant. And if you have a port that for the last 3 years, your annual tonnage was less than 8 million short tons, you may apply for a special project or a special pot of the money within the large bucket of 450 million. But you have to be a small port as defined by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers only tracks 150 ports. And they have many ports that are on that list. I can tell you if you're on the list or not, if you have a question about that. But if your port is not one of those 150 and you want to be, give me a call and we can talk about what it takes to get on the list. And then you'll probably want to hire some professionals to help you get on that list. I know Port Fourchon used to never be on this list, but there is. They are on the list now, and they fought to get on it. They worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they got to be one of the 150. Let's see, more wisdom from Rob Mariner. Rob says for the funding awarded under BIL, which as I said is IIJA, there's no minimum award size. There actually is maximum award size. You have to read through other parts of the, so I'm going to disagree with Rob on this one. There are maximum award sizes and it's stated. So program objectives and Rob, if there's things that you see that you and I disagree on, let's talk about it after this session and then let's clarify it in the next session, because I know train systems is the key on that one. Let's not take time today to do things that are contrary. If you're correcting me, I absolutely appreciate it. If we're disagreeing, you know, let's go back because that's a 77-page thing and there's a lot of details in there. Program objectives, you can read what they are. Yes, thank you. You can read what the program objectives are. Notice advancing equity and opportunity for all. That's a really key phrase. These are all new objectives, except for leveraging federal funding to attract non-federal sources. That's you, and they've done that every year. That's always been an objective for the program. Next slide, please. There's additional strategic goals, and these are all pretty new. There's a lot of words because I wanted to fit them on the slide. But cybersecurity has never really been part of the PIDG program, and it is now. Safety management systems, that's new. Job creation was always a strategic goal, and sometimes, especially in the Obama administration, they named it. But when they talk about job creation, they don't mean construction jobs, because the DOT knows those are jobs for 2 years, maybe 3 years. What they want are the long-term jobs that are going to pay a living wage. And that's what you should talk about. You can address the construction jobs, but don't just do that. Address other jobs your project will create as well. Restoration of port and terminal assets. So that could be restoration after a disaster or restoration after time. Maybe it's outlived its useful life. And they know now that investing in port projects, the asset will live for up to 50 years. And it's worth talking about the life expectancy of the asset. Modernization or adding resiliency for the supply chain. You know, they never talked about the supply chain in relationship to ports before. And now because it's been in the media and because ocean carriers and port terminals have become the poster children for the supply chain during COVID, you can now put in resiliency projects or modernization projects and talk about how it'll improve the flow into the supply chain or from the supply chain. What is community livability? I think a lot of us in the industry know that a community adjacent to a port often has a higher incidence of asthma-related issues because of emissions from the port, and that's from the vessel, from the train, from the cargo handling equipment. And often it's a lot of times from the trucks that are in that adjacent community, idling, waiting to get into the port. So a gate project, expanding a gate, will improve community livability. Separating truck traffic from passenger traffic, like they did in New Orleans, that improves community livability. Providing, let me read through a couple of these. Integrating a disadvantaged or underserved community in the planning development. Public engagement with the community. That could be that you're holding port project meetings and inviting people from an underserved community that isn't necessarily adjacent to your project, but maybe 20 miles from your project. And rather than just writing in your application, we had this and we invited the people from this community, you could show that you went to that community, you met in the local gymnasium of the school, you talked about the port project and the jobs being created, you talked about the training program that you're going to set it up for these new jobs. And you're talking about that you're going to run a bus to and from that community so people could actually get to work. Or you're going to give them bus passes to take or metro passes if you've got a high-speed rail or a rail service that serves that community, and bring them into your project. There's actually transit system grants that will help you do those kind of things and add to your project. And you could videotape that. You can interview some of the people, and then you could put together your own short YouTube video, put a link to your application, and boom, now they can see that you've done this and see it. So be creative in your applications and how you're demonstrating you're doing this. President Biden's net zero emissions goal by 2050 has to be addressed in all applications. Some of this, frankly, I've never seen before. Institutionalizing climate-informed decision-making. Those are words I never strung together in my life, but they need to be addressed. And this is where professionals come in. Let's see. Let's keep going because there's more information on the next slides. And this is equity and inclusion. We've never seen language about equity and inclusion. We've seen language about livability, but not equity inclusion directly addressed. And in yellow is the definition of what equity is. And I, for one, as I was learning about this, I expected to see race, religious, sexual orientation. I did not expect, and I don't know why, I didn't expect to see abilities and disabilities addressed. I didn't expect to see residents. So they're saying if you are addressing equity and inclusion, your project may be in an urban area, but you may be adjacent to a rural area. And if your workforce comes there, you could actually talk about the equity and inclusion of rural residents that are subjected to or have been subjected to persistent poverty, and how your project will do outreach to that community. And that will get you greater consideration by this administration. And here's all these suggestions. And I got the language from the NOFO, but the action verbs are mine. It says you have to include an equity impact analysis into the project. So I said incorporate it in. I talked a few minutes ago about good paying jobs, more than construction. Interesting to me that the NOFO actually had the quote with the free and fair choice to join a union. A lot of NAWE's members, I would say 98% of NAWE's members work with ILA or ILWU. So it's very easy for our industry to address that goal. Strong labor standards, you know, you have to comply with the Davis-Bacon Act as a minimum compliance and put Davis-Bacon signage up when you get one of these grants, but stronger labor standards like training programs, you know, other things that I'm sure Transsystems Group will talk about in the next 3 sessions. Any questions about PIDG? I think that's it. What's the next slide? Yeah, Marine Highway. Any questions on PIDG? It's a big topic. We're going to talk about it all 5 sessions. Okay, thank you. Going on to marine highways. Marine highway grants. I've actually tried to work with the Senate Commerce Committee who reached out to me and asked me how could they make the marine highway program more usable. And I said, take some of the bureaucracy out of it. Because right now you have to be a designated marine highway, and pretty much all the navigable waterways are now designated marine highways. There's very few left to be designated. And then you have to be designated a project on a marine highway. And I could see where we did that initially because we were trying to figure out what is a project, but now they know the program's been in business for a long time, well over 15 years. And I think they should be able to take that away, but they haven't. So right now you need to be a designated project designated by the Secretary of Transportation, and then you can apply for a marine highway grant. If you are part of a designated project and you're the private partner in the designated project, if your public partner who was designated, who was the designee for the project, let's see, if you are the Virginia Port Authority, because you're designated for a project on the M64, you can actually write a letter authorizing a private entity to apply for the grant. And then you don't have to be responsible for it. They could actually award the grant directly to the private entity. So there's a number of public entities that are designees for project. They have project designation. But like the PIDG program and like RAISE, this program also requires, and it's something I didn't talk about previous slides because I just thought they were so dense. This one says that you have to support the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative. So climate and clean energy has to flow to disadvantaged communities. I'm sure Transsystems will discuss this and clarify this in future in one of the 3 sessions they're running. If not, you know, our last session is Bob Bouchard, who has headed this since Tiger started. He's going to be our speaker for the last session, and he's going to talk about the do's and don'ts and answer all your questions. It's our chance to have Merit, who administers these, as our speaker. Next slide, please. Is it worth it? I just threw a whole bunch of stuff at you. Is it worth it to apply? The cost to apply, if you're hiring a contractor, will be well over $100,000, especially for the bigger programs. If you're going to do it in-house, you still have to look at the cost of you doing it in-house because there's a cost to your labor to do it. Required match for the project is minimum of 20%. More is better. The odds of winning the grant, I just put RAISE and PIDG down there. And I verified with Merit. In the past, PIDG was 20%, 25% chance of getting an award. And they're very proud of that, and they should be. But with 450 million, possibly another 200 plus million, it could be more applications are going in, or it could be not. So it could be that the odds are going up to get that, or the odds could come down. And then you could get anywhere from $1 million to $500 million. So you need to weigh it, because getting a grant is not a financial plan. Getting a grant is an exploration and an adventure and something that's strategic. And for those who get it, it's still work, but you're getting millions and millions of dollars. And it will help you move your projects forward faster if you get the grant. But you do have to do that analysis. Last slide. There's one more, right? Yeah, thank you for attending. And you know, it didn't take 2 hours. Are there more questions? All right. Rob, you may have shot my credibility, or they know that they're going to get a chance to meet with you and that you're really good at this stuff in the future sessions. So March 9th, Bonnie, yeah?
Yeah, Lauren, can I ask you a question? I'm not new to grant funding for other kinds of entities, but I am for ports. And I'm curious, there are some entities out there, and I wonder if others know about them, where they will help you when you say it's $100,000 you might spend on a professional out there that may help you, but then take a percentage of the grant, is it? It's like
I don't know how that works.
You
I
don't.
really don't. So you mean it's like a lawyer? If you, like a defense lawyer, if you win, they get a percentage?
Exactly. It's like a pro bono thing. I was curious if anybody had experience with that, and if so, if we knew some of those entities.
A good question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Good question. Tom?
Hi, Lauren. How are you?
Good, Tom. How are you?
Good. Great job today. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the next session. Lauren, as you did last year, which was very helpful for our commercial teams, you plan on circulating, this is more informational for folks, 1 to 2 page analysis of PIDP NOFO.
I do, Tom. Yes. And I just had to get this webinar PPT done with all the other legislative work we're doing. And yes, now I'm going to wrap up and get that 2-pager out.
Very good. That was very helpful. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Tom. Any other questions or comments? Has anyone worked with or been approached by a consultant who wanted a percentage for winning? And I think the odds are so difficult to get one. I'd be shocked. I think they would want to be paid up front for the work. It's a lot of work.
Good afternoon. I can share that we've worked with Leonardo Academy and they've won some grants for us. And it was based on our 10% ratio.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? No. All right. We'll look forward to seeing you on Thursday. Grant Applications 101 and NEPA.